Welcome everyone to the Ontology Summit 2022. Today is February 16th, 2022. And pleased to welcome our speaker today, Mark Fox. And I'll turn it over now to Ravi, who will give him an introduction, and then we'll have a really interesting meeting about urban disasters, urban
And I want to say a
emergencies.
few words too, Ken.
Gary,
Yeah,
yes, that would be good.
I was just going to say a few words. Welcome, folks, to the Ontology Summit session. We have an interesting speaker, very experienced, who I have read a little bit on the web about, and I can say he has worked a lot on ontologies, on smart cities, urban area work, and the details of which will be spoken about and introduced by my colleague, Gary Birdcross.
Thank you.
Okay.
Welcome, Mark, Dr. Mark Fox. Mark has a PhD in computer science, artificial intelligence emphasis from Carnegie Mellon back in 1983, which are the good old-fashioned AI days.
Yeah.
And also a BS in computer science from the University of Toronto, all the way back in 1975. Mark is a distinguished professor of urban systems engineering and professor of industrial engineering and computer science at the University of Toronto, where he seems to be today. He's the director of the Urban Data Center, which is part of the University School of Cities. So very relevant for our talk today on ISO IEC Workgroup 11 Data Standards for Public Health Emergencies. Mouthful. I think this work reflects Mark's now decade-long work to develop core concepts to facilitate the modeling of urban evolution. Mark presented some early work on urban issues at my RDA session in 2014 and 2015 on domain vocabulary development, standardizations, registration, harmonizations, and support. The idea behind this work is to be able to automate diagnosis of why cities perform well or poorly based on ISO indicators, ISO 37120. There are about 100 indicators such as water, education, public safety, relevant to our topic here, but they're not used consistently. And that cities are not measuring themselves in the same way. An underlying question is, are the way cities are reporting consistent with the definition of the data we are trying to provide? Can we compare between cities? Obviously, ontologies can help here, as well as with challenges that cities face, such as in public health. Dr. Fox is a fellow of the Association for the Advancement of Artificial Intelligence, the Institute for Electrical Engineering, as well as the Engineering Institute of Canada. But perhaps most importantly to this community is that Mark mentored Michael Gruninger on the call today, along with Michael Ushrow, back in the mid-90s. And of course, both Marks have contributed mightily to Ontology Summits. Mark's work on methods for enterprise modeling and competency questions helped move ontology work forward. Mark's article with Mike Gruninger called Methodologies for Design and Evaluation of Ontologies, posted in 1995, has over 2,000 citations. And so with that, as a little bit of background, let me turn it over to Mark.
Thank you, Gary. Some of that I don't even remember. Let me get the screen up and share. 1 second, please. Okay, and here we go. So my presentation today is not on the work that I have been involved in over the last 30, 40 years, but can be viewed as the culmination of work I and others have done over the last 30, 40 years, to the point of bringing it to the standardization process. First, I just want to say that everything that I'm going to talk about is a culmination of work that's done by a large number of people with whom I've worked with in my lab, outside of my lab over the years. Mike Gruninger certainly is on the call today, is a major contributor to the work that we did on TOVE, enterprise modeling ontologies, the work done by Megan Katsumi more recently. Sorry. Okay. The work that Megan Katsumi has done with, or I with her, on the IEC ontologies, Bart Gajarowicz, Daniela Rosu, and others, too numerous to name, have been direct or indirect contributors to the culmination of my more recent work in the standards area. The presentation today is solely focused on standards and is not meant to be a review of what we have done in the past. But I'm more than happy at the end of the presentation to entertain any questions regarding this presentation and anything else that I and my colleagues have done together over the years. First, let me start with describing the acronyms that is in the title. I'm involved with what's called the ISO IEC JTC1 Working Group 11 on Smart Cities. ISO stands for the International Standards Organization, which is a worldwide global organization which countries are members of and focused on the development of standards. And these standards span everything and anything. The International Electrotechnical Committee is not a standards creating organization, or what we often refer to as an SDO, but they are concerned with providing documents that are research studies into areas of common interest and guidelines and things like that, but not of a standards nature. The two come together to form the Joint Technical Committee #1 for the development of standards that are of interest to the technical side of ISO, and obviously because they're an electrotechnical, everything they do is technical. So the subset of ISO that is interested in technical standards is done via the Joint Technical Committee #1. And Working Group 11 is a working group within the Joint Technical Committee #1. And Working Group 11 focuses on technical standards for smart cities. And that working group is composed of subject matter experts and standards bureaucrats. And what I mean by that is that around the table at these meetings are people who have deep knowledge of, in this case, smart cities or some aspect of smart cities. And it's also around the table one finds people whose professional life is committed to the development of standards and are more oriented to the process of developing standards as opposed to the content of those standards. And they represent numerous countries from around the world. I'm not sure how many countries are a member of ISO, but let's say over 100. And countries will choose if they want to be involved in a particular working group by nominating people from their country as subject matter experts or staff type people. The development of a standard, for those who are not aware of it from an ISO point of view, is an iterative process in which members of the working group can propose the creation of standard. There are standard proposal forms for doing that. Those proposals then get sent out to the member countries of JTC1, who then approve the project or not approve the project going forward. And if approved, we start the standards development process, which can take up to 3 years, minimum of 2 years, up to 3 years, because there's a significant amount of iteration that occurs as a standard goes from just being a rough document in a committee, a subcommittee of a working group, to being available to the members of the working group beyond the subcommittee, to being available to members of the Joint Technical Committee, which is basically the countries, most of the countries around the world. And each of these steps have one or more iterations where feedback is provided by the various countries and their subject matter experts into the content of that particular standard. Okay. So the context of my presentation today is a standard that I am the editor of. It's actually a series of standards. It's ISO IEC AWI 5087 City Data Model Standards. AWI basically says that the standard has not been published yet, and by the term published, that means it's being voted on, accepted, and is now approved as a standard. We are in the process of iteration right now, where portions of this standard are out for review by the Joint Technical Committee member countries. This 5087 standard is actually a multi-part standard or a series of standards. And we're going to see what that looks like on the next slide. And what makes this standard a little bit more unique from most technical standards within ISO IEC is that the data standard is being defined using description logic, and an implementation using OWL is provided. To get a little deeper into what the standard contains, there is 5087-1, which is the foundation level of the standard. And in this standard, there are concept patterns that cover concepts such as time, location, activity, resources, etc. We'll see a little bit more of that on the next slide. Building on that is level 2, 5087-2, which is the city level. And this is a city-wide ontology, which contains concepts that are both read and written by multiple departments, divisions of a city. And so it can be read and updated by multiple services. So these concepts are shared across the various divisions. And then we have the -N service level standards, which span concepts commonly associated with a particular service, but still shared with other services, such as vehicles, transportation networks. So it can be read by multiple services, but updated only by one service. So what's in blue here is the criterion we use for determining whether a particular concept appears at the city, at the -2 level, or appears in a service data standard, which could be -3, such as transportation planning, which is one of the standards we have under development, or there could be another standard for water and sanitation, education, and what we're talking about today is public health emergencies. Now, the question mark is here simply because the creation of a standards project has not yet received approval, as we're waiting for all the votes to come in. But what I want to make clear here is that the intent of this data standard is not to capture everything and anything about public health emergencies or transportation planning or any other service, but to capture only the concepts that would be shared with other departments or divisions across the city. So that means if we're talking about transportation, our standard would not represent detailed maintenance information about vehicles or roads or things of that nature, which would not necessarily be of interest to other divisions or departments across the city. And that way we limit the amount of detail to only that which is necessary to be shared with other departments and divisions across the city. So that's the basis of the 5087 series of city data standards. And just to give you, and one thing to keep in mind is that the process of development is iterative as we select a city service at this level. We apply the ontology engineering process to it. And through the creation of standards at this level, we end up revising what's at the citywide ontology level and what's at the foundation level. One thing that you need to know is that within the ISO IEC community, standards get updated, can be updated every 4 years or so. So the experience of creating these standards will result in feedback into the next versions of these standards here. Just to give you an idea of the types of concept patterns that are contained in each of these 5087 parts. This is 5087-1, the concept patterns. And what I mean by pattern is a set of concepts that are closely interrelated around the same theme. So we have an activity pattern, which is based upon the TOVE activity ontology. We have a pattern around agreements, agents, city units, change that is representing the change in a particular instance over time or individual over time. We have a pattern for general properties I'm not going to get into. We have a pattern on location, which is based upon OGC, geosparkle, mereology, organization structure, which is based upon W3C organization, provenance, which is based upon the W3C Provo, recurring events, resources, time. One of the reasons why it's important for me to put in here in blue what we base these on is that where possible, we don't create new standards. Where possible, we reuse standards that have already been published. And so when you look into 5087-1, it is not creating a new location standard or time standard or organization structure or provenance standard. It is simply reusing it. And these are referred to as being normative to these standards. Certainly is the case that many of these other concept patterns that you see here are based upon other work that has be done by ourselves and others in the ontology community, whether it be resources at a TOVE, change based upon 4D representation, et cetera, et cetera. The second level, the city level, contains the following concept patterns: buildings, bylaws, the representation of the city itself from a spatial perspective, geospatial perspective, and also a governance perspective, contact information for individuals and organizations, the representation of contracts, households, indicators, physical infrastructure, land use, persons, organization. This organization is an extension of the W3C organization to include concepts of programs and services. And we have a service representation here, residents, sensors, et cetera, et cetera. And then at the third level, getting into the service level, our transportation planning standard covers concepts such as parking, transportation systems, transit vehicles, trips, trip costs, travel costs. And 5087-4, which is the topic of my presentation today, includes these concept patterns, but even more, such as disease, government, logistics, vaccination, public health event, et cetera. Now, I want to make sure that everybody understands what I mean by ontology and what we include in our standards from an ontology perspective. So if we take as an application the development of the standard data standard for transportation planning, transportation planning in this case predicts transportation demand over a multi-decade horizon. In order to predict demand, we have to simulate how the city will change over those decades. For example, how households and their members will change over time and their changing transportation requirements as they age. Now, when I think about ontologies, which hopefully may be similar to how you think about ontologies, I think about it in terms of levels. At the lowest level of an ontology, we have a knowledge graph, which is the graph representation of class properties and instances. I'm not going to dwell on this because knowledge graphs, et cetera, are being covered in Summit, et cetera. And one has classes and properties that deal with residents, households, members, transportation networks, vehicles, et cetera, et cetera. The second level, when I think about ontologies is when we start to include more of logic in defining classes and using that logic for inference, such as automatic classification, etc. So an example of a class is a Toronto resident, and the definition of that class is resides in, owns property, or owns or operates a business in Toronto. Or definition of a household is composed of at least one person who resides at the same address. At the second level, we are entering into the definition of an ontology that is more accepted by the ontology community. And then the third level is in microtheories, and I missed Doug's presentation a week or two ago, but I'm sure that Doug probably went into this in detail. So for me, microtheories are the third level of an ontology, where you define what the axioms or rules are that allow you to deduce new things or answer questions, etc. For example, for each year above the age of 14, a member of the household will leave with the probability of PH. Anyway, when I talk about creating a standard, I talk about, when I talk about creating a standard, we are often talking about an ontology light. So by ontology light, we are definitely defining the classes, properties, etc. for a knowledge graph. And we are adding to it some amount of logical definitions, but it will not necessarily contain the complete logical capability for defining things. So we are light on the definitions, and we certainly don't get into microtheories in the development of these standards. So in essence, these standards are more focused on the knowledge graph with an extension of providing some level of definition to the data standards. So let me make that real for you. City resident is one concept that exists within the 5087-2. The reason why it's included is it turns out that a lot of services within a city are the receiving of certain services in the city is dependent upon whether you are an actual resident of that city. For example, free transportation for seniors who are residents of the city. And so one could use the definition of a city resident to verify that a person who requests a service is a resident, or given a database of people determining who the residents of the city are, or validating manually provided classifications of residency, or inferring characteristics of residents based upon them being a resident of the city. Now, given that we want to be able to support this type of reasoning, how can we support it using an ontology? First, we start by looking at examples of what a city resident is. And so the interesting thing about a city resident is if all you want to do is create a class called resident and define it, that's not going to be good enough for recognizing whether somebody is a resident of a city, because the definition of a resident is dependent upon the city that that you want to be classified as a city resident. And so the ontology needs to be able to provide the tools, that is the properties and the classes with which to construct these definitions of whether you're a Toronto resident or a Beijing or New York or Germany. Toronto, again, you are identified as a resident if you reside in, own property, or own or operate a business in Toronto. I'm going to be using that as my example in the next couple of slides. So from a knowledge graph perspective, if all we want to do is define or identify, let me use the term identify, what the properties and classes are, it's relatively straightforward as depicted by this graph over here, this knowledge graph over here. Toronto resident is subclass of resident. It has a property, owns property in Toronto. Toronto resident resides in Toronto, operates a business. A business has an address, and that address has to be in the city. Now, obviously, because it's a graph and it's not a logical definition, conjunctions, disjunctions, requirements, absolute requirements, etc., are not captured. And so one has to go to a richer representation, which brings us into things like description logic. And this is not description logic, obviously, but it's a simplification that I use when I'm presenting to people who are not knowledgeable about description logic or first order logic or whatever, but it captures the essence of what we're talking about. Toronto resident, subclass of resident, and resides in Toronto or owns property or operates a business which has an address in the city of Toronto. And if I want to cause the audience to cross their eyes, then I'll go and I'll put it into description logic, which provides a little more detail. So this representation in DL captures the essence of who is a Toronto resident. But in 5087, we don't include these types of description logic definitions. We only include partial definitions in a table format using the Manchester syntax. So we can capture things like universal and existential quantification on the values of properties, cardinality restrictions, members of, values of, etc. So there's a number of description logic things we can capture, but we don't necessarily capture the full logical combination of ands, ors of properties that you would see in a description logic definition like this. So that is the perspective I bring to the Working Group 11 table, is that my goal is not only to create city data standards for city data at all these levels, but to move them closer and closer to providing definitions that are more logically complete than what you would normally provide. And the danger is that adoption of these standards, if we go too far down into logic, which I'm happy with, is the ability of the cities that we're trying to impact, their ability to actually assimilate what it is that we're attempting to standardize. And so we have to work in a world that they're more familiar with. Sadly, they're most familiar with spreadsheets, but they are familiar with tables. And so we try and make it easier for them to understand what it is that we're trying to do. So that brings me to the data standard for public health emergency. I'm not going to be going into detail in it because it's still under development. But this morning when I was reading my emails at 6:30 or whatever it was, 7 o'clock, actually it was between 6:30 and 10 or so, I got two emails. One is that told me that I was the only speaker today. I was only planning on spending 10 minutes speaking. So I had to go and work on my slides some more. And then I saw the email from Azamat Abdulalev, which I found intriguing. So let me read the email that came out to the Ontology Summit group. So allow me to share my humble experience to moderate a 200,000+ Facebook public group on AI, ML, and DL, which has started from zero. As everybody here, I hold in high esteem Ravi and whatever he is doing. There you go, Ravi. There's a shout out to you. Nevertheless, why such a narrow topic agenda for Ontology Summit as data standards for public health emergencies with respect to its authors? Thank you. When there is a crying demand for real ontological topics like data standards for ontologies, for science and technology, for AI and ML, and then he provides a link, and this could revive our 1,000- slowly dying microform, attracting much more aspiring members. Again, the summit could not be a summit with virtually 10 to 20 people. I too agree that it'd be great if we had more people. How many people do we have right now? About 18. It'd be great to have more. But I'm not going to delve into that at the moment. Let me respond. I mean, I could talk ad nauseum about what he said, but I don't have a very good diplomatic filter. So better to say nothing than talk about it. But let me say the following. Why is it that a public health emergency data standard is worth focusing on? Well, the most obvious reason is we just shut down the world for at least 2 years because of PHE. And if that isn't motivation for developing standards for public health emergency data, I don't know what is. So that's number one. Number two, we live in a world of limited resources and time. We need to better understand, coordinate, and efficiently and effectively respond to the challenges that cities, states, and nations face. And I, being a student of cities, I've spent over a decade focusing my research on ontologies and other areas on cities for over a decade now. And quite frankly, I've developed a deep understanding of the extent to which legacy systems within cities have created data silos across the departments and divisions. Okay. And hence, a first step to breaking down the silos is the creation of data standards. So let me emphasize this. Doesn't matter what city you go to, you would think that they would have a data standard for things as simple as names, addresses, phone numbers, covered addresses already, dates, etc. And the reality is, most cities don't. And this is a conversation I not only have with cities in Canada or North America, but cities I have around the world. Now, that doesn't mean that all of them don't have a standard for these fundamental entities that span the entire city. There are some cities that are much better than others. And within cities, there are some departments that are much better than others. So you can't make a blanket statement. You can't assert a blanket statement. But to the extent that I have seen, I'm always surprised as to how little the standardization effort has received attention and how little it has actually been adopted. And one of the things that hinders adoption, there's two things. So I do work with the City of Toronto, and I've worked with other cities, but I'll use City of Toronto as an example. For the last decade, they have been trying to get agreement on a standard set of terms by which they can refer to things that they do in the city. Okay, so they made the transition for adopting a standard set of terms to refer to things such as healthcare, such as the services they provide, and transition to the source, because individual departments and divisions absolutely refuse to adopt anybody else's terminology within the city, because each department is a legacy department, grew up independent of every other department, developed their own terminology, and they're unwilling to give it up. And so breaking down the silos is easy to talk about from an academic perspective. It is extremely difficult when you're talking about municipalities, et cetera. And so the first step to breaking down silos is the creation of these data standards. But the key point is not to force the individual departments to change their databases, to change their information systems, to use these data standards, because it would cost trillions of dollars for all cities everywhere to start changing their information systems. Instead, you focus on, if you're going to communicate information from one part of the city to another, from one division to another, from one information system to another, here's the standard with which to communicate that information. That way you don't have to go and change your information systems in order to be consistent with the standard. And that's the approach that we're taking with the City of Toronto, is not to force them to change internally, but just to force them to change how they externally communicate. And quite frankly, stating that data standards for X is the most important thing, as stated earlier, is not very helpful. It's not helpful at all. So what are we doing with the 5087, or what I'm calling the 5087-4 Public Health Emergency Data Standard? Is that we have undertaken an analysis of the different types of use cases that exist for a public health emergency standard. And what you see here are the 13 use cases that are in the standard that we're using to develop the standard: contact tracing, disease tracing, drinking water pollution management, emergency medical resource management, food poisoning management, infection prevention for medical personnel, mental health management, stakeholder volunteer management, testing, transportation management, vaccine distribution, vaccine efficacy, vaccination management. Now, as you can see, not all of these are related to COVID, such as drinking water pollution, food poisoning, et cetera. But most of these use cases apply to the pandemic situation. For example, transportation management. You may look at it and say, why is that important? Well, in China, they closed cities and they weren't allowing anybody to enter or leave the city. Well, how are you going to get vaccines into the city? How are you going to move essential workers into and around the city? It requires transportation management. We understand vaccine distribution, how to get it from the point that it enters into the country or the city to all the different places where it has to be distributed is a major issue. Determining the efficacy of a vaccine is a major issue. Managing who gets what vaccines. I don't know about you, but we're living through the, okay, third vaccine, fourth vaccine, who's eligible, who's not eligible, all that type of stuff. Resource management, ICU beds, major concern. So all of what we have been experiencing in the last 2 years are the motivation for many of the use cases that we see here. The way we handle use cases within the development of this standard is not only to define the use case. The city receives vaccines from multiple sources, both within the country and outside of it. The distribution team has to know when and where and what type of vaccine they're receiving. Plan and implement distribution across the country, balancing supply and demand. Manage distribution centers at both regional and local levels. Assess the inventory and status of all vaccines, such as are they expiring? Dynamically adapt to changes in the supply chain. That then leads to a series of competency questions. What are the planned shipments of vaccine X that are to be received from manufacturer M during the time period? What is the inventory of vaccine X at location Y? And it goes on and on and on. So we develop a set of competency questions by which we can use to evaluate the completeness of our ontology. And then, based on the use cases, we undertook a review of the literature to identify what types of concept patterns exist out there. And we, anyway, let me add to that in a little bit. To identify what the concept patterns are in our review of the literature, we found concept patterns such as patterns for representing cities, the diseases, the emergency medical resources, government organization, logistics and distribution, medical activity, medical personnel, microorganisms, organization, person, public health event, vaccination, et cetera. And we identified these by reviewing a large number, by both reviewing the use cases and identifying in these use cases what patterns were appearing. And so what we see, each row corresponds to one of these patterns. And we identified for each of the use cases whether that pattern is being used or appropriate for each of the use cases. So that's how we actually identified the patterns we believe we needed to represent based upon the use cases. And then we did a review of the literature of vocabularies and ontologies that are out there to identify in each of these vocabularies and ontologies in the literature what patterns are included in each of these. And so we can see here the representation of the city is only in CODO and OPM, whereas diseases are represented in some form across most of these ontologies and vocabularies. And what I mean by some form is that they represent various properties and classes within the disease area, depending upon the focus of these ontologies. Now, we actually have a more detailed analysis that identifies a subset of disease classes and properties for each of these ontologies or vocabularies that have been identified. So we can get a feel for where we can go to learn how they go about representing infection transmission, medical activity, medical resources, et cetera, as a basis for constructing the standard. And so just as an example, this is a bit of the concept pattern for the public health event. A public health event is a subclass of activity. Epidemic is a subclass of public health event. Public health event has a time and location and other properties. I don't show the full set of properties. And an epidemic is composed of a case. A case is associated with a person and a disease at some time and at some location. And there's also representation of clusters and outbreaks with more information about that are composed of these cases. So that just gives a little bit of an example of the pattern associated with the public health event. So now I'm coming to my end. What's the status of all this? We've conducted our survey of existing vocabularies and ontologies related to public health. And we have a paper available in draft form if people are interested. We also have the draft ontology light, meaning that we don't use full description logic to define our classes and properties. And that paper is available in draft form if you're interested. And we're currently in the period of time where the countries are voting on whether to proceed with the creation of a public health emergency data standard. So that is the end of my presentation, and I'm happy to take any and all questions. Any questions?
Excellent presentation, Professor Fox. We have, I'm sure, a lot of questions. Some are on the chat, SOAP Hub chat, and some are probably going to be asked live by participants. So I certainly have a lot of questions, but I will request others to first speak. Of course, your colleague has a comment and a question, Michael Groninger. So where do we want to begin, Gary? You have a comment, overarching comment? I have some.
No, I think starting with Michael's observation about the obvious is relevant for ontologies as a whole, because with our background knowledge, we're constantly sort of adding things in and assuming that everybody else has the same background knowledge as we do, but that's not the case at all. It's what made AI hard, adding that common sense knowledge.
Mike?
No, sure. Yeah, I have maybe a quick question. So when you had the one example, Mark, you had of the resident, right? And so that was represented as a class within OWL. But if you wanted to represent the ability for residents to change, so people moving around or whatever, then that would be represented differently within your ontology, right? So how do you kind of integrate the static notions, definition of a resident with a dynamic concept of residents changing?
Thank you for asking that question, Michael. So one of the things I didn't show in the definition of resident was the actual complete definition within the 5087-2. One of the things that let me actually put that up on the screen. So I'll go and share again. And one of the things that I mentioned in the, oops. hang on. One of the things I mentioned was the existence of, at the -1 level, is the representation of change. And what that gives us the ability to do is to say that any class is a subclass of what we refer to as a manifestation. And what the manifestation allows us to do is then represent what is equivalent to multiple instances of the same thing. So if I want to represent Michael Gruninger, I can say Michael Gruninger is an instance of a manifestation, and we can have multiple manifestations which are ordered in time, in which each manifestation identifies the changing values of properties. And so we use manifestations as a means of capturing the changes that occur over time. And we link all the manifestations so that we can look at Michael Gruninger today, yesterday, day before, or whenever changes have been provided within the representation. So that's the more fuller representation of, let's say, a person. And what you find in the standard 5087-2 is that a lot of the classes are subclasses of manifestations, and hence can support the specification of changing values. So that's how we do it.
Does that answer, Mike, what you were after?
Yep, thank you.
I have a further question to the same concept. You used provenance O, PROVO. Could that query based on provenance not provide change information with time? So marrying the concept from change to provenance and then doing time based queries. Time is certainly a parameter in your last one.
Yeah, and Ravi, I hear what you're saying, but it doesn't capture the complete semantics of what we're trying to achieve. It's certainly the case that you could use some of the properties to represent, using Provo, the fact that something is derived from something else, some entity is derived from something else, and that's certainly the case. But the problem is when we're dealing with individuals, we have to be able to say all these individuals are part of the same original individual, such as Mike Gruninger. And Provo doesn't provide that semantics explicitly. Provo doesn't provide the semantics for representing what can change and what cannot change. So if I look at the a vehicle representation, there are certain properties that we don't change. One is the manufacturer of that vehicle. Another may be the VIN of that vehicle. And so the change ontology provides for the identification of what properties are mutable and which properties are immutable over time. So yeah, you could make Provo do some of the work, but it doesn't capture the full semantics of what we need to represent with respect to change. And the big issue that we had is the ability to say that all of these, in essence, instances are are associated with the same Michael Gruninger in this particular case.
Identity, yes. Okay. So
Mark?
that does answer.
Ravi?
Yeah, go ahead, Todd.
Ravi, may I ask? Okay, Mark, first of all, there will be a slight delay because of my satellite connection, but I want to get back to this notion that you talked about called manifestation. Why did not you use the notion of a role, that is a disposition that has some temporal constraints on it, so that if we want to pick on Michael again, there is a person who has an identifier name of Michael, and I'm sure Canada has some sort of other identifiers associated with him, and then there's the role of Michael as a beer connoisseur, a role of Michael as a beer manufacturer or creator, the role of Michael as a professor, the role of Michael as a great host, and so on. So why wasn't the notion of role used?
It's just that role itself doesn't have the semantics that we're trying to associate with the fact that it's an individual changing over time, and there are properties that change and properties that don't change. So that's the biggest obstacle there. And then you got another issue of if you look at the organization ontology, W3C organization ontology, entities have roles as opposed to being a subclass of a role. And so it's certainly the case that I could say Michael Gruninger has this role, but we want to represent the fact that Michael Gruninger is changing over time. And what you've done is you've taken an orthogonal approach that says, I'm going to associate with the individual Michael Gruninger a set of properties, and I'm going to fill all those properties with 100 or thousands of values. Each one of those values has to have a time interval associated with it. So now what I'm forcing myself to do is, while role itself allows for the representation of a time interval for when you hold that role, all the other properties that are associated with Michael Gruninger, we now have to introduce intermediation in order to capture the time period over which that value is appropriate. So it's really an issue of whether every value that you're representing is being forced to be an instance of a class, as opposed to being a literal a data property which is not intermediated. And so, but if you want to do that, I mean, that's one way that you could do it, is you could say, hey, here's my instance of Michael Gruninger. Now, for every property, go through and pick out the value of that property that I've intermediated that's appropriate for this time period. Or using the change ontology that we have is say, find the manifestation of Michael Gruninger for this time point and give me the values of the properties.
Okay, so is the definition of manifestation in your change ontology or somewhere else?
It's in the change ontology. So I'm happy to send you the definition of the change. Send me an email and I can send it to you.
Will do. Thank you, Mark.
Welcome.
Is your email on our slides that you have shown today?
No. Here, I'll
Can
put it.
we-
I'll put it into the chat.
Yes. We have a lot of questions. Gary, you want to start, or I can?
Why don't you start?
Well, I have a lot on the chat board, the SOAP Hub. You are saying that you would only share the vocabularies for shared information with other agencies. What happens to the core vocabulary for the domain that you have, you are defining? For example, say transportation, or for example, say the disease. So not only intercommunication among various operating departments of the city, but also core within each area. Are you neglecting that, or are you cursorily covering the core ontology, core vocabularies?
So the answer is simple for that. We are solely focused on data that is shared across within the city and shared with external stakeholders. We are not concerned with core data that is not shared outside of a particular department or service.
So
There's two reasons for that. One is that would make the standards development effort that we are focused on to be infinitely long. That is, the depth of knowledge,
Yeah.
the depth of data that exists within a particular service area is huge.
Yeah.
And there already exists standards groups. For example, in the transportation area, there's something called TC 204 for Technical Committee 204. They're called Intelligent Transportation Systems, and they're the ones who are developing all of the core transportation related ontologies. It's not ontologies, but data standards for transportation. So they're the ones who get into the actual data that's that's flowing through a vehicle's information system within the vehicle, et cetera, they're doing the heavy lifting at that level, whereas we build on top of it by looking at the data that flows between the different services, et cetera.
Yes, I got the idea that the domain of depth is being covered by respective authorities in much more detail. For example, difference between flu and coronavirus and so on. I understand. Now, second point, which is, I'm skipping some of my questions, but the point is, can you not use a coordinated efforts from city councils, budget approving authorities, state and federal funding agencies, World Bank, UN, which support various projects for cities, to act as a catalyst for forcing the adaptation of common data standards?
The answer is simple. First, you have to convince those agencies that they should be adopting those.
Yes.
Okay. And that itself is a major challenge. So for example, I am working with the Public Health Agency of Canada, which is responsible for, let me rephrase that. They are not responsible for data standards across the whole country, but they are putting together data sets for access across the whole country, which could use a data standard for the classes and properties that exist within those data sets. So there's a huge issue of, when you're dealing with government organizations, as to A, finding the right point of contact to communicate with, and B, determining whether they actually have a mandate for creating data standards, and see whether they have the authority to actually impose those standards within their jurisdiction. It's a very tangled web, and it's a web that I crawl along on a continuous basis at the municipal, provincial, and federal level, at least within Canada, and in communications with India and China and all that type of stuff. So.
Thank you. Thank you for that explanation. Can we not talk a little bit about appropriate at the level of maturity of the city? Some cities have very basic data. Some probably can use ontologies in machine tools, in automated tools, IT tools, rather than spreadsheets. Can one solution telescope down to the appropriate level?
So first of all, you can never talk about cities as a single entity. You have to look at the individual departments or divisions within a city, because each department division is run by a different manager. Each manager is more or less comfortable with technology. Each manager is more or less comfortable with being innovative. So within the same city, you'll find departments or divisions whose systems, information systems, and use of information systems is decades old, and you'll find other departments that are into AI and machine learning and things of that nature. So it varies across the departments, divisions within a city, and that's true at the provincial and federal level. It is the case that some will get the message and agree to adopt some of these data standards, but it's always a challenge. A good example is, I have a project with the city of Toronto to look at the adoption of a urban data model, a minimum viable urban data model that can be used to share data across the different divisions. Their first initiative to do this was in the standardization of names and addresses and phone numbers about 8 years ago. The best that they've been able to do is publish a guidance document, but have not been able to impose it on the different departments and divisions. And so whether it has been adopted, or they know it hasn't been adopted, but they're extremely limited in terms of the impact. I'm talking about the part of the city that's responsible for data and technical systems, et cetera, is not able to impose their will on the other departments, divisions. Now, every city will be different in terms of the ability of one part of the organization to enforce change on others. But my experience is it's very difficult, and it's an issue of leadership. And even if you have the leadership.
So there are cities at one end of the spectrum, like New Orleans, which prepared itself for floods, and New York, which had a strange flooding experience in its subways, was not prepared. On the other hand, in Philippines, we see a lot of storm damage. In Indonesia, in India, and so on. So how are cities waking up to the new climate challenges of disasters? Do you have any idea? Of course, it is not related in detail to your detailed work.
Well, again, I have to fall back as it depends upon the leaderships of the city and the leaderships of the individual departments and divisions. I know within the city of Toronto that they started working on their climate change plans over 10 years ago. And they have been diligently working to changing the bylaws, the development approval process, and other aspects of the city to better take into account climate change and climate disasters. But again, you know, there's no blanket statement about cities around the world. Every city is different in how they approach it. In this particular area, I think the city of Toronto is actually pretty advanced in their approach to dealing with it. But, you know, look at, I was just reading an article about Los Angeles yesterday about they are moving towards recycling all water because they are in a decades-long drought. And they're starting to do things like Singapore, which also focuses on recycling of water, et cetera. So again, each city is different in terms of what they can do. I mean, I could talk about another disaster, you know, where the topic of this series is on disasters. Another disaster that I think the world is aware of is that we have these freedom truckers that have taken over the capital of Canada, Ottawa, by parking their trucks everywhere. And the Prime Minister has now imposed the Emergency Act to provide the resources to get them out of Ottawa. But we had nothing happen in Toronto. And the reason why nothing happened in Toronto, we don't have truckers all over the place parked in the streets, is that the police and the mayor of the city got together and figured out how to deal with it, which is to block off access to the areas of the city to truckers. And so we didn't have the problem. And the truckers parked the trucks outside of the area and then walked in to protest. Well, sure, they can protest all they want. Just leave your trucks back in the parking lot. So each city is different when it comes to that type of disaster. Toronto was very good in handling it. We didn't have a problem. So anyway, every city's different when it comes to dealing with disasters.
Slightly switching the track, how do you use the digital twin initiative with your work?
Well, it's very simple. There's no such thing as a digital twin without a model of the city.
Yes.
Okay. And you have two choices in creating a digital twin. You can create an ad hoc model of your city, which is not shareable with anybody, or you can use data standards for creating the model of your city. Okay. I believe that what we're trying to do with data standards is central, critical to what people are calling digital twins. The sad thing about the evolution of digital twins is it came out of visual simulations without a focus on standards for representing city data. And so it makes it difficult to renovate those visual applications, those simulations, to use standard data models. But any real digital twin effort going forward has to use a standard data model to represent any aspect of the city. So I believe it's critical, and there's no such thing as a digital twin without a city data model. And going forward, there should be no such thing as a digital twin using a city data model that is not based on standards.
My last question, Ravi's, is what is a smart city and what is not a smart city?
Oh, gee. Robbie, you should give me warning about that one, because I'd look it up for, I'd tell you. Anyway, my definition of smart people is a city that's managed by smart people.
Yeah.
Smart city is a city managed by smart people. You don't need technology to be smart. You need people to be smart. Smart people will use the right technology where appropriate, which is very different than the views that are totally technology oriented. One of the things that I show people is I show examples of smart city technology, like controlling the street lamps, waterfalls, Sidewalk Labs, when they were proposing their smart neighborhood here in Toronto, was talking about face recognition to open the door to a building, etc. And all these people, everybody's saying, these are smart cities, these are smart cities, these are smart cities. And then what I do is I show them the budget for the city of Toronto. And the budget of the city of Toronto is not focused on street lamps and waterfalls. It's focused on the basics of water and sanitation, transportation, parks and recreation. The budget is spent, billions and billions of dollars are spent on things that none of these organizations or researchers are exploring as smart city. To me, a lot of them are just demonstrations of neat uses of technology, but do not get at the 90% of the services that a city provides. And so we need to start focusing on 90% of the services and not the periphery, which many of these smart city applications reflect.
Thank you, Gary.
Well, I have a simple question. It's a little bit off the track of what we've talked about so far, but Mark, you and Mike, for example, have produced a number of ontologies along the way. Do you have a common repository? Where would one find these? We have to go to individual works, or is there a repository where you could look at these?
I'm putting it into the
The
chat.
chat.
So all the ontologies that I have been involved in, including some that Mike has been involved in, though I don't have all of Mike's there, and Mike has his Colore repository, which he can put in his thing, but everything that was TOV related, everything that's iCity related, everything that's ISO related, they're all findable at ontology.eil.utoronto.ca, both the documentation and the OWL implementation.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
We want to, we are up on our time limit, but unless there are some very pressing questions, I request that we thank Mark, Professor Mark Fox, and thank him for his tremendously relevant effort at uniting communication among different departments of the cities of future and creating a very hard data standards task. Very illuminating, lot more to discuss sometime. And then just for your information, Doug Lannett will revisit this, and maybe you can tell us what use you see of the micro theories, etc. Please keep in touch with our postings and sessions. Thank you so much, Ken. I hand it over to you. Gary, anything else?
Just a reminder, what is the latest for next week? We had on the schedule a synthesis session. Is that still correct?
Yes.
It's a synthesis session, and I have asked Matthew West if he would give a kind of motivation for the synthesis at the beginning, to give a, kind of an overall motivation for what we should do at the synthesis session. So
Okay,
that's what's coming up next week.
right. And after that, we'll be into the sequence on pandemics and COVID.
Right, then we're going to have 1 month on pandemics. Okay, thanks, Mark. That was great.
Mark, kindly do not forget to send us a copy of your slides.
Will do. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you.